In 1841, on a plantation in Natchez, a young slave girl named Leah Brown was given a simple task: to mend her master's bed sheets. She was quiet, obedient, and like so many others, she could not read or write a single letter. Yet when the sun rose the next morning, the master's wife discovered something impossible, something terrifying stitched into the fine linen. It was a name, Leah's name. That night, in the middle of a raging storm, Leah vanished from her cabin without a trace. The only clue left behind was the set of sheets found days later by the riverbank, folded perfectly, with the mysterious stitching having vanished as if it were never there. How could an illiterate girl write her own name, and where did she go? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The air in the sewing room was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from the smells of lye soap, starched cotton, and the faint metallic tang of human sweat. Sunlight, heavy and yellow, forced its way through a single dusty window pane, illuminating a swirling galaxy of lint and dust motes that danced in the oppressive stillness. This was Leah Brown's world, a small, stuffy box where her value was measured in the tininess of her stitches and the invisibility of her mends. At 17, she was slender and moved with a quiet grace that made her seem to glide rather than walk, a useful quality in a house where the sudden sound of a footstep could be cause for a sharp word or a sharper blow. Her eyes, dark and deep, held a weariness that belied her years, but her hands were a different story. They were things of skill and precision, the fingers long and deft, the calloused tips a testament to a life spent with a needle and thread. The door opened with a soft creak, and Mistress Caldwell entered, her presence immediately sucking what little air remained from the room. She was a woman in her 40s, her face a rigid mask of strained propriety, her lips perpetually pursed as if tasting something sour. A constant visible tension radiated from her shoulders, tightening the fabric of her gray muslin dress. In her arms, she carried a bundle of white linen, holding it away from her body as if it were a sacred relic. She laid the fabric across the small wooden table where Leah worked, the fine material seeming to glow against the dark, scarred wood. "These are the master's sheets, Leah," Mistress Caldwell said, her voice thin and brittle like ice cracking. "They came from England. There is no finer linen in all of Natchez." She unfolded the sheet, and even in the dim light its quality was undeniable. It was smooth and cool to the touch, with a weight that spoke of its expense. Her finger, pale and bony, pointed to a small, jagged tear near the hem. A careless pull from one of the other girls. "I want you to mend it." Leah looked at the tear. It was small, but the fabric was so fine that any repair would be a challenge. The mistress leaned closer, her scent of lavender and disapproval filling Leah's senses. "The master is particular," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more threatening than a shout. "He notices everything. I want this stitch perfect. The thread must be matched exactly. The work must be so fine that no one could ever tell there was a tear at all, as if it never existed." Leah nodded, her gaze fixed on the linen. "Yes, mistress." The words were a familiar surrender, a soft murmur that asked for no argument and promised only obedience. A tiny, treacherous flicker of pride ignited within her. The recognition that she, of all the girls, was being trusted with this task. It was a fragile flame, and the familiar dread of failure, a cold and heavy weight in her stomach, quickly extinguished it. To be chosen was to be noticed, and to be noticed was to be in danger. Perfection was not a goal, it was a requirement for survival. She watched as the mistress left, the door clicking shut, leaving Leah alone with the impossibly white sheets and the crushing weight of the command as if it never existed. Her calloused fingers, so accustomed to rough cotton and burlap, felt clumsy and foreign as she gently touched the edge of the English linen. As dusk settled over the Caldwell plantation, the world softened into shades of bruised purple and hazy orange. The air, finally cooling, carried the sounds of weary bodies returning from the cotton fields, the low murmur of tired voices, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and the comforting smell of wood smoke and cooking food. Leah sat on a small wooden stool outside her cabin, the precious linen draped carefully over her lap, away from the dust of the yard. She worked with intense focus, her needle a tiny silver fish darting in and out of the white fabric as the light began to fade. Old Ilara, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles and her eyes as deep and knowing as the river itself, came and sat beside her on a crate. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who had seen more than 70 winters and had earned the right to take her time. She watched Leah's hands for a long moment, a faint, appreciative hum in her throat. "That's fine work, child," Ilara said, her voice a low, raspy melody. She reached out a gnarled hand, not to touch the fabric, but to hover just above it, feeling its quality in the air. "That ain't plantation cotton. That's the master's own skin he sleeps in." Leah nodded, not looking up from her work. "From England, the mistress said. Ilara's observation prompted a shift in the old woman's mind, pulling a thread from a tapestry of stories passed down through generations. She looked past Leah, her gaze fixed on the distant shimmering line of the Mississippi River, a silver serpent winding its way through the dark green landscape. "They think they own everything," she began, her voice dropping into the rhythmic cadence of a storyteller. "They think they own the land, the cotton, our hands, our time. They think they own the children we birth." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the quiet air between them. "But they can't own our name. A name is a song, a prayer. It's the piece of your soul the river remembers long after your body is gone." Leah's hands slowed. She looked up at Ilara, whose eyes seemed to reflect the last light of the setting sun. The scene felt intimate, secretive, a world away from the grand house and its demands. "Our people," Ilara continued, her voice a hypnotic hum. "When they was stolen from Africa, they brought their names across the water. Those names got lost, got beat out of them, got replaced with names like Caldwell or Brown. But the spirit of a name, that don't die so easy. It lives in the blood, and it remembers the water." She leaned a little closer, her presence warm and grounding. "They say the big river, that Mississippi, it holds the memories. It holds the souls of all our ancestors who crossed the ocean. You go down to the water and you whisper your name to it. You give it your name to hold. That way you are never truly lost. The river knows who you are, even when you forget." Leah listened, her heart beating a little faster. The story resonated in a place deep inside her, a place that was hollow and unnamed. She had always been Master Caldwell's girl, or just Leah, a sound, a label. She had never considered it something that belonged to her, something with power. She looked toward the river, which was now turning a deep, inky blue in the fading light. It was no longer just a body of water, a landmark on the edge of the plantation. In her mind, it was transforming into a vast, mystical entity, a living repository of history and identity. A profound, aching yearning rose within her, a desire for an identity that could not be owned, a name that was truly hers. She looked down at the fine linen in her lap, at the nearly invisible stitches she was making, and a strange thought surfaced. As quiet and persistent as the river's current. What is my name? The night was heavy and moonless, the cabin thick with the sound of sleeping bodies. A single tallow candle sputtered on a small crate, its weak flame casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the rough-hewn wooden walls like frantic spirits. Leah couldn't sleep. The exhaustion from the day was a dull ache in her bones, but her mind was a whirlwind, caught in the currents of Ilara's story. The river, the names, the souls, it all churned within her. She picked up the sheet again, the fine linen cool and smooth beneath her fingers. The tear was almost gone, her stitches so tiny and precise they had become part of the fabric itself. She only had a few more to make. As her needle moved, the world around her began to recede. The sounds of breathing faded. The flickering candlelight seemed to steady and brighten, and the oppressive heat of the small cabin dissolved into a cool, peaceful quiet. Her mind, usually so guarded and alert, drifted away from the present, away from the fear of the master and the weight of her task. She entered a state that was not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness, a deep and profound trance. Her fingers, which had been guided by years of practice and conscious control, began to move with a will of their own, an instinct that came from a place deeper than memory. She was no longer mending. The needle was not just a tool, it was an extension of her spirit, flowing through the fabric with an impossible grace. The thread was not mere cotton, it was a conduit for the desperate, unspoken yearning that had taken root in her soul. Fueled by Ilara's words and a lifetime of suppressed identity, her hands began to form shapes. They were not the clumsy, blocky letters she had seen in the master's books. This was a different kind of writing, an elegant, flowing script that seemed to grow organically from the linen. The shapes twisted and curved like river reeds bending in the current, like the delicate, searching tendrils of a wild vine. It was a language of the soul, and it spelled a word she did not know she knew: Leah. The motion was fluid, effortless, a dance of needle and thread. She felt a strange, powerful energy flowing through her, a sense of creation that was both exhilarating and deeply calming. When the last stitch was pulled tight, the energy receded, leaving her feeling drained, hollowed out, but strangely, profoundly peaceful. She blinked, and the world rushed back in. The candle flickered, the air was hot and close again, and the sound of her cabin mate's soft snores filled the silence. She looked down at her work, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. In the dim, wavering light, all she saw was the perfectly mended tear. The linen was smooth, the seam invisible, just as the mistress had commanded. Unaware of the miracle she had just performed, the name her very soul had cried out onto the fabric, she carefully folded the sheet, placed it aside, and finally surrendered to a deep and dreamless sleep. The next morning, the master's bedroom was flooded with a sterile, unforgiving sunlight that made every polished surface gleam and every speck of dust visible. A young house servant named Rose, her movements quick and nervous like a field mouse, was making the grand four-poster bed. She pulled the fresh linen sheet, the one Leah had mended, up towards the pillows. As the fabric settled, her eyes caught on a strange pattern near the center, a series of dark blue threads that seemed to writhe against the stark white. It was not a stain, and it was not part of the linen's original design. It was embroidery, but unlike any she had ever seen. She couldn't read, but she knew these were marks with meaning, too deliberate and elegant to be an accident. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Anything out of the ordinary in this house was a source of danger, and this was profoundly out of the ordinary. She glanced nervously toward the door, her hands frozen above the sheet. Just then, Mistress Caldwell entered the room carrying a silver tray with a porcelain cup of tea. She placed it on the bedside table and turned, her eyes immediately falling upon the unmade bed and Rose's petrified posture. "What is it, girl? Are you daydreaming?" she snapped, her voice sharp. Rose flinched and pointed a trembling finger at the sheet. "Mistress, I don't know what this is." Mistress Caldwell moved closer, an expression of annoyance on her face that slowly dissolved into disbelief and then into a cold, hard fury. Unlike Rose, she could read. She recognized the letters instantly, their flowing organic shapes forming a name that had no business being there, stitched into the very heart of her husband's bed. Leah. The audacity of it was breathtaking, a violation so profound it felt like a physical blow. Her face, already pale, drained of all remaining color, leaving behind a waxy, translucent mask. For a moment, she felt a dizzying sense of unreality, as if the world had tilted on its axis. This was not just defiance, it was an act of witchcraft, a slave girl marking their bed as her own territory. A cold, creeping fear, ancient and primal, slithered beneath her rage. It was impossible. The girl was illiterate. This was a trick, a conspiracy designed to mock them, to unravel the very fabric of their world. Her hand flew to her throat, her knuckles white. The stitched name seemed to pulse in the bright morning light, a silent, screaming declaration of an identity that was supposed to be non-existent. Master Caldwell's study was his sanctuary, a dark, wood-paneled fortress against the chaos of the world. Books he had read and many he had not lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines a testament to a knowledge and power he believed was his by right. Maps of the lands he owned were framed and hung like trophies, their neat lines and boundaries a comforting illusion of his absolute control. He was a proud, imposing man, his posture rigid, his face set in a permanent expression of stern authority. His legacy, his name, and the order of his world were the pillars of his existence. When his wife entered without knocking, her face ashen and her hands clutching the folded linen sheet, he knew one of those pillars was under attack. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She didn't speak. She simply unfolded the sheet and spread it across his massive mahogany desk, over the open ledgers and scattered papers. He stood up, leaning over the desk to look. His eyes, accustomed to scanning contracts and deeds, narrowed as they traced the impossible script. L-E-A-H. The name was a brand on his property, a flag planted on conquered territory. A deep volcanic rage began to build within him, but it did not erupt. Instead, it cooled, hardening into a chilling, controlled fury that was far more dangerous than any shout. He ran his finger over the stitching, feeling the texture of the thread, the slight elevation of the letters. It was real. He saw it not as a plea for identity, but as a personal, calculated attack. It was a slave, his property, claiming a piece of him, marking his most intimate space as her own. The girl, Leah, she did this, his wife whispered, her voice trembling. "She cannot write," he stated, his voice flat and cold. The fact, which should have been a defense, was instead the core of the insult. It meant this was a conspiracy, a complex and malicious trick designed specifically to make a fool of him. Someone had put her up to this. Someone was testing him, mocking his authority from within his own walls. "What devilry is this?" he murmured, his eyes still fixed on the name. It was a question he did not expect an answer to. He straightened up, his decision made. The mystery was an affront, but the response would be simple and absolute. "They are mocking me in my own house, on my own bed linens," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. He looked at his wife, his eyes like chips of flint. "Find the girl. Bring her to me, now." The great hall of the main house was designed to intimidate, with its high ceilings, its cold marble floor, and the stern, painted eyes of Caldwell ancestors staring down from the walls. It was into this grand, chilling space that Leah was dragged, her arms held tightly by two grim-faced overseers. She was genuinely, utterly terrified, her mind a maelstrom of confusion. One moment she had been sorting laundry behind the kitchens, the next she was being hauled towards the house like a criminal with no explanation. When she saw the master and mistress standing before the grand staircase, the white linen sheet draped over the master's arm, a primal fear seized her. Master Caldwell's face was a mask of cold, implacable rage. He let the sheet unfurl, holding it up for her to see. He pointed a rigid finger at the name stitched in the center. "Did you do this?" he demanded. Leah stared at the marks. They were beautiful, like patterns she might see in nature, but they meant nothing to her. She had no concept of letters, no idea that these elegant blue swirls formed her own name. She could only see the fury in the master's eyes and the sheet she knew she had mended. I mended the tear, master," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Just like the mistress told me." "Do not play the fool with me," Caldwell hissed, stepping closer. The sheer force of his presence made her flinch. "You think to mock my name in my own house? You think you can put your mark on my property?" He accused her of insolence, of conspiracy, of witchcraft. He demanded to know who taught her, who helped her, who dared to orchestrate such an insult. Leah's denial was passionate and raw because it was the absolute truth. She remembered nothing but the mending, the exhaustion, the dreamless sleep. "Master, I swear on my life," she cried, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling uncontrollably. "I don't know what them marks is, I can't write. I swear I only mended the tear, that's all I did." Her genuine terror and confusion only infuriated Caldwell more. To him it was a masterfully played lie, an act of defiance so perfect it was infuriating. He saw her tears not as a sign of fear, but as a tool of manipulation. The power imbalance between them was a vast, unbridgeable chasm. He was the master, the reader, the owner of everything, and she was the slave, the illiterate, the property that was suddenly, inexplicably talking back. Leah felt the world shrinking around her, the grand hall pressing in, the accusing eyes of the portraits bearing down. The injustice of it was a physical pain, a sharp stone in her chest. She was being condemned for a crime she could not even comprehend, a sin she had no memory of committing. The name on the sheet was a mystery to her, a beautiful, terrible thing that had appeared from nowhere to destroy her. Shaken and weeping, Leah was eventually dismissed, not because she was believed, but because her unbroken denial gave Caldwell no satisfaction. She stumbled out of the great house and into the blinding sunlight, her body still trembling from the ordeal. She sought the only person she could, the only one who might offer some semblance of understanding in a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. She found old Ilara behind the kitchens, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl, her movements slow and rhythmic. Leah collapsed onto a nearby stool, the story tumbling out of her in a torrent of sobs and fragmented sentences. She described the master's rage, the mistress's cold horror, and the strange, beautiful marks on the sheet that they called her name. As she spoke, describing the flowing shapes that looked like river reeds, a profound stillness came over Ilara. She stopped shelling the peas, her gnarled hands resting in her lap. She looked at Leah, and in her deep, ancient eyes there was no shock or confusion. There was only a solemn, knowing recognition. She understood. She recognized the event not as an act of defiance, but as a sign, a calling from the spiritual world she had spoken of. This was not the work of a rebellious slave, but the work of a spirit answering a call. "Hush now, child," Ilara said, her voice a soft, calming balm on Leah's raw nerves. She reached out and placed a hand on Leah's trembling arm. "Breathe. This wasn't you, not your hands alone." Leah looked up, her tear-filled eyes wide with confusion. "But they said it was my name." "And so it is," Ilara affirmed, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial hum. "But you did not write it. Your heart did. This is old magic, child, the kind that flows in the blood and sleeps in the water. The river heard your heart's desire. It heard the name you didn't even know you were crying out for." Ilara's gaze drifted towards the distant line of trees that marked the path to the Mississippi. It has marked you as its own. That name on the sheet, that is a claim. The river is claiming you. A shiver went through Leah, but it was not entirely from fear. Ilara's calm certainty was a stark, grounding contrast to the chaos of the great hall. They cannot harm you now, Ilara continued, her voice filled with a strange power. Not in the way that matters, but you must be ready. The water is coming for you. For Leah, the terror of the master's interrogation began to recede, replaced by a strange and profound sense of wonder. The supernatural explanation was both terrifying and deeply empowering. It gave meaning to the inexplicable. She was not a criminal, she was not a liar. She was chosen, marked by a power far older and greater than Master Caldwell. The name on the sheet was no longer a symbol of her crime, but a symbol of her connection to something vast, ancient, and free. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was mingled with awe. The river was calling her name. In the days that followed the interrogation, a malignant quiet fell over the Caldwell plantation. It was not a peaceful silence, but the tense, watchful stillness of a swamp holding its breath before a storm. Master Caldwell, unable to beat a confession out of Leah, had retreated into a state of simmering paranoia. His authority, once as solid and unquestionable as the earth itself, now felt like a flimsy mask. He had been challenged by an impossibility, and the mystery gnawed at him, souring his mood and poisoning his every interaction. The whip, once a tool of targeted punishment, now sang for the smallest of infractions. A dropped tool in the field, a slow response to a summons, a glance held a second too long, all were met with a swift and brutal response. Workloads were increased, the meager evening privileges were revoked, and a permanent air of suspicion hung over the quarters, as thick and choking as the summer humidity. The stitched name, though seen by only a few, became a whispered legend among the enslaved. It was a ghost story told in the dark, a myth that grew with each telling. Some saw Leah as a hero, a vessel for a power that could mock the master in his own bed. They looked at her with a new, fearful respect, their eyes holding a mixture of awe and hope. She was a sign that their world, so rigid and cruel, had a crack in it, a place where magic could seep through. Others, however, saw her as a curse. They feared the master's unpredictable rage, which now fell upon them all like a hail of stones. They avoided her, their faces turning away as she passed, their silence a heavy accusation. They believed she had stirred the hornet's nest and that they would all be stung. Leah was trapped in the center of this storm, isolated by the very event that had given her a name. She was caught between the awe and the fear of her own people, and the cold, simmering hatred of the man who owned her body but could not conquer her spirit. She walked through her days in a daze, the world of the plantation feeling thin and unreal, while the memory of Ilara's words and the pull of the river felt more solid and true than the ground beneath her feet. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and red, a figure detached itself from the line of workers trudging back from the cotton fields. It was Jonas, a young man whose strength was not just in his broad shoulders, but in the steady, pragmatic light in his eyes. He had been watching the master's paranoia curdle into madness, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it was only a matter of time before that madness found its focus and destroyed Leah. He caught up to her at the edge of the field, his presence urgent and quiet. "Leah," he said, his voice a low, anxious rumble. He glanced around, ensuring they were not being watched. "We have to talk." He led her behind a large water oak, its branches draped with moss creating a curtain of privacy. "I've seen the way the master looks at you. He ain't gonna let this go. He's like a dog with a bone, and he'll keep chewing until there's nothing left." Leah looked at him, her own fear mirrored in his concerned face. Jonas was real. He was solid. his hands calloused from the same work that wore down her own. He was not a man of spirits and river magic, but of plans and tangible action. "My plan is ready," he said, his words coming faster now, his desperation clear. "I've been saving food. I know a route north, following the creeks to avoid the main roads. It's dangerous, but staying here is a death sentence. For you, it is for sure." He reached out and took her arm, his grip firm but not rough. His touch was a shock of reality, grounding her in the immediate physical world. "Leah, this place is poison now. That name on the sheet, it's a ghost that will haunt us all until he finds someone to blame, and that someone is you. We can be gone by morning. Come with me." His plea was a lifeline, an offer of a future she could almost picture, a life of hardship and struggle, but a life that would be theirs. "A real escape, Leah," he urged, his voice softening. Not whatever story Alara is telling you about the river." His words hung in the air between them, a choice laid bare. The north, a place she could only imagine, a direction, a promise of freedom bought with sweat and fear and miles of running. Or the river, a place she could see and feel, a mystery, a promise of a different kind of freedom, one that was whispered in the blood and carried on the current. Jonas's offer was a life, a chance to be a woman, his woman, a person in the world of men. It was a desperate, beautiful hope, and it tore at her heart. Later, as twilight bled into true night, Leah found herself drawn to the riverbank, the place Alara had spoken of. She stood alone at the water's edge, the mighty Mississippi, a vast, dark expanse of moving power before her. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. The choice Jonas had given her was a war inside her. A future with him was a path she could almost understand. It was a life of running, of hiding, of constant fear, but also of shared burdens, of human touch, of a future built by their own hands. She could picture his face, feel the warmth of his hand on her arm. It was a tangible hope, a freedom she could fight for. But as she stared at the water, another feeling rose within her. A pull that was just as strong, if not stronger. It was the feeling she'd had in the sewing room, a sense of being part of something ancient and vast. Here by the river, she felt a strange and profound sense of peace, a feeling of belonging that she had never known within the confines of the plantation, or even within her own skin. She knelt and dipped her fingers into the current. The water was cool and alive, tugging at her hand as if in greeting. She thought of her name, the name she had not written but had been born from her soul. Who was Leah? Was she the woman who would run north with Jonas, forever looking over her shoulder? Or was she something else? Something tied to this water, to the whispers of the ancestors Alara spoke of, to a freedom that was not about a place on a map, but about the liberation of the spirit itself? Jonas offered her a life. The river, she was beginning to understand, was offering her a legacy. To run with Jonas was to escape her bondage. To answer the river's call felt like transforming it. She looked at her reflection in the dark, swirling water. The face that looked back was that of a stranger. A girl caught between two terrifying, uncertain but powerful forms of freedom. The choice was not between slavery and escape, she realized. It was a choice of which freedom to claim as her own, the physical or the spiritual, the path of the body or the path of the name. While Leah wrestled with her destiny at the river's edge, Master Caldwell was wrestling with his own demons in the suffocating silence of the main house. Sleep offered him no escape. The image of the stitched name was burned into his mind. He could not leave it alone. Long after the house had fallen silent, he rose from his bed, his movements furtive, like a thief in his own home. Lighting a single candle, he unlocked a small, unused spare room on the second floor, a place for storing forgotten furniture and out-of-season clothes. Inside, he knelt before a heavy cedar chest and lifted the lid. The scent of cedar and old linen filled the small space. There, resting on top of a pile of winter blankets, was the sheet. He lifted it out, the fine fabric cool and heavy in his trembling hands. He spread it on the floor, the candlelight casting a weak, flickering glow over the white expanse. And there it was, the name, Leah. It seemed to mock him from the floor, a testament to his failure, his lack of control. His anger from the interrogation had cooled and congealed into something far more corrosive, a maddening, all-consuming obsession. He was no longer just furious, he was haunted. He got on his hands and knees, his face close to the fabric, and traced the letters with his finger, feeling the raised thread, the impossible perfection of the stitches. He was a man of logic, of ledgers and laws of ownership. This defied all of it. It was a puzzle he could not solve, a lock he could not pick. How could an illiterate girl produce such script? Who was the true author of this insolence? His inability to answer these questions was a direct assault on his intellect, his power, his very identity as master of his domain. The name on the sheet was more than just an act of defiance. It was a mirror reflecting his own impotence. He was a man consumed by a mystery he could not solve, a symbol of his ultimate terrifying lack of control over the people he believed, with all his heart, that he owned completely. The only sound in the locked room was the rustle of the linen and the heavy, ragged sound of his own breathing as he stared and stared and stared at the name that was driving him mad. Inside Ilara's cabin, the air was a world away from the oppressive order of the great house. It smelled of dried herbs, of river mud, and a faint, clean scent of wood smoke that clung to the rough-hewn walls. Bunches of dark leaves, strange roots, and dried flowers hung from the low rafters like sleeping bats, and on a small, uneven shelf, smooth, dark stones were arranged in patterns that seemed to hold a secret logic. Ilara was sitting on a low stool, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes closed. She did not seem surprised when Leah entered, but opened her eyes slowly, a deep, solemn understanding within them that required no words. She had been waiting. In the quiet resolve on Leah's face, she saw that the choice had been made. The river's call had been answered. Without speaking, Ilara rose with a grace that defied her age. She moved to a small wooden chest in the corner, its surface worn smooth by time, and from it she retrieved a small, supple leather pouch. From a clay jug she poured cool water into a shallow bowl, water that Leah knew had been drawn from the Mississippi at dawn, when the spirits were most active. She beckoned Leah to kneel on the packed earth floor. The ritual began in a profound silence, a conversation held without language. Ilara first handed Leah the pouch. The leather was soft and cool, and through it Leah could feel the brittle texture of dried herbs, the smooth, heavy weight of a single dark river stone, and the impossible softness of a single iridescent feather. It was a collection of the earth, the water, and the sky, a portable piece of the world she was about to join. "This is your name pouch," Ilara whispered, her voice a low chant that was almost part of the storm's distant rumble. "It holds what you are and where you are going." Then Ilara dipped her gnarled fingers into the bowl of river water. She touched the cool water to Leah's forehead, a blessing for her thoughts, for the journey she was about to undertake in her mind. "May your mind be as clear as the water on a calm morning," she murmured, her words not from any church sermon but from a place far older, a language of the soul that flowed into Leah and settled her spirit. She anointed Leah's palms, the very hands that had stitched the impossible name into being, the conduits of the miracle. "May your hands be strong for the journey, may they let go of what must be left behind." Finally, she touched the cool, sacred water to the soles of Leah's bare feet, which were calloused and scarred from a life of labor and bondage. "And may your feet know the path home. the path that was made for you before you were born. A profound sense of peace, as powerful and encompassing as the river itself, settled over Leah, a calm that pushed out the last vestiges of fear. The cool water on her skin felt like a promise, the earthy smell of the herbs, the solid weight of the stone in her hand. It all felt right, a confirmation of the choice she had made at the water's edge. This was not a ritual of escape, a desperate act of a runaway. This was a consecration, a preparation for a journey, a transformation from one state of being to another. "You will not be running, child," Alara said, her eyes locking with Leah's, their dark depths seeming to hold the wisdom of 1,000 generations. "You will be returning. The body is just a boat, and you are taking it back to the great water it came from. Do not be afraid. The river knows your name. It has been singing it since the day you were born. Tonight, you will sing it back." Her voice was filled with a strange, fierce joy. "It will carry you home." Leah left Alara's cabin, the small leather pouch clutched tightly in her hand, its contents a secret trinity of power. Her purpose was now a solid core of heat within her, and it guided her steps through the deepening twilight toward the stables. The air smelled of hay, horses, and the damp earth, a familiar and grounding scent from a life she was about to leave. Inside it was dark and quiet, the only sounds the soft shuffling of horses in their stalls and the gentle munching of their evening feed. In the faint light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls, she saw him. Jonas was in an empty stall at the far end, his back to her, packing a small burlap sack with a frantic, nervous energy that spoke of his terror and his hope. He had a small portion of hardtack, some dried meat he had likely stolen from the smokehouse at great risk, and a full water skin. He was making his final preparations for the desperate flight north. He heard her soft footstep and spun around, his body tensing, his hand instinctively going to a heavy piece of wood he had propped against the wall. When he saw it was her, his posture relaxed, but the tension in his face remained, replaced by a desperate, pleading hope that made Leah's heart ache. "Leah," he breathed, his voice a mixture of relief and anxiety. "I was afraid. I thought you weren't coming." He took a step toward her, his eyes searching her face for the answer he so desperately wanted. "It's not too late. We can still go. Everything is ready." The sight of him, so real, so solid, so full of desperate, tangible hope, sent a pang of pure sorrow through her. He was offering her a life, a future, a world where their freedom would be a thing they fought for together, side by side. It was a beautiful, painful, and impossible thing to refuse. She shook her head slowly, the simple motion feeling as heavy as a millstone. "I cannot go with you, Jonas," she said, her voice soft but firm, imbued with the calm certainty Alara had given her. His face fell, the hope in his eyes flickering and dying like a spent candle, replaced by a frustrated confusion. "What are you talking about, Leah? Don't do this. Caldwell will kill you. He will make an example of you. This isn't a game." He reached for her, his hands gripping her arms, his touch a desperate anchor to the world he wanted for them. "It's not too late. Whatever Alara told you, it's just stories. Old woman's talk to make the darkness bearable. This," he shook his head, gesturing to his meager supplies, "this is real. The North is real. Freedom is real. But you have to run to it. You have to bleed for it." She did not pull away. She looked into his eyes, wanting him to understand, even though she knew he could not. "My path is different, Jonas," she said gently. She couldn't explain the river's call, the feeling of destiny, the peace that had settled in her soul where fear used to live. To him it would sound like madness, a surrender. She opened the small pouch Alara had given her and took out the single soft feather. It seemed to glow with a faint light in the gloom of the stable. She pressed it into his hand, her fingers closing his over it. "This is for your journey," she whispered, "for your protection." It was a heartbreaking goodbye, a farewell between two people standing on the precipice of freedom, but whose definitions of that freedom had diverged into two separate, irreconcilable worlds. "Leah, please," he begged, his voice cracking, his pragmatic strength broken by his fear for her. "Don't throw your life away on a story." "Go north," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. She pulled her arms gently from his grasp, a final, sorrowful separation. "Be free for both of us. Live a long life. And when you see a river, any river, remember me." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the shadows of the stable, clutching a single useless feather, his heart breaking as he watched the woman he loved choose a fate he could not comprehend over a life with him. As true night fell, a change began to work its way through the world. A massive storm, born in the warm, turbulent waters of the Gulf, began its inexorable march inland. The air, which had been still and heavy, began to stir with a restless energy. The sky, once a clear, star-dusted black, began to curdle, turning a deep, bruised purple-gray as a vast bank of clouds swallowed the moon and stars. A low, distant rumble, like a giant awakening from a long slumber, vibrated through the earth, a bass note of impending fury. The wind was the first to arrive in force. It started as a whisper. A sigh through the leaves of the live oaks, then grew into a mournful moan and finally into a furious howl. It rattled the window panes of the great house, making the crystal glasses in the dining room tremble with a high, singing note of fear. It tore at the flimsy walls of the slave cabins, finding every crack and seam, filling the small spaces with a chilling draft, and the sound of a world coming apart at its seams. The ancient trees bent and swayed, their branches lashing at each other in a frantic, violent dance against the bruised sky. Then came the rain. It did not begin as a gentle shower. The first drops were heavy and cold, striking the dry, packed earth with audible smacks. They fell faster and faster until the individual drops merged into a solid, roaring sheet of water that blurred the edges of the world, erasing the familiar lines of the plantation. The sound was deafening, a constant percussive roar that drowned out all other noises, isolating every person in their own small bubble of noise and fear. It was a storm of biblical proportions, a violent cleansing of the land. The natural world seemed to be responding to the unnatural events on the plantation, its fury mirroring the emotional turmoil and the impending climax of Leah's story. The rising wind and the darkening sky built a powerful, undeniable sense of foreboding, a feeling that the very elements were charged with a supernatural energy, gathering their strength for the final transformative act. In the heart of the storm, the world of the Caldwell plantation shrank to the confines of its buildings. The overseers, their authority rendered meaningless by the tempest, were hunkered down in their quarters, drinking and waiting for the dawn. Master Caldwell, a prisoner in his own grand house, paced his study, the howling wind a perfect symphony for the storm in his own mind. The plantation was blind and deaf, its inhabitants sealed in their shelters, oblivious to the quiet procession taking place outside. Leah slipped out of her cabin. She did not run. She did not hide. The door made no sound as she closed it behind her. She walked with a calm, steady purpose, her head held high, her shoulders back. The wind and rain whipped around her, tearing at her thin cotton dress and plastering her hair to her face. But she seemed unaffected, a small, resolute figure moving through the heart of the chaos. She was not an escaping slave terrified of the dogs and the whip. She was a priestess going to her temple, but a bride going to meet her groom. Her bare feet found the muddy path that led from the quarters to the river, a path she had walked 1,000 times in servitude, but which she now walked in absolute freedom. She held the smooth, dark river stone from Alara's pouch in her hand, its weight a solid grounding presence. The stone was cool against her skin, a piece of the river she carried with her to her final meeting with it. The storm seemed to rage around her, not against her. A brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, and in that instantaneous blue-white flash, her path was illuminated, the churning, muddy waters of the Mississippi visible ahead. The river was swollen and angry, a terrifying spectacle of raw power, its surface a chaos of waves and whirlpools. But Leah felt no fear. She felt a pull, a sense of homecoming. Her walk was a procession of one, a final sacred act. She was not running from something, she was walking toward everything. The scene was not about terror or escape, but about destiny and an awe-inspiring sense of release. She reached the water's edge, the muddy ground sucking at her feet, the roar of the river and the storm becoming a single, all-encompassing sound that filled the world. She had arrived. The morning after the storm was born of a deceptive and profound peace. The air, washed clean by the deluge, was cool and carried the fresh, earthy scent of wet soil and bruised leaves. The sky was a pale, flawless blue, and the sun cast a gentle golden light over a world that seemed newly made. But the tranquility was a lie, a thin veneer over the chaos the storm had wrought, and the deeper chaos that was about to be unleashed. In the slave quarters, the first sign that something was wrong was the stillness of Leah's cabin. When her cabin mate rose for the day's work, she found Leah's sleeping pallet empty and cold. It was not unheard of for someone to rise early, but there was an unnerving emptiness to the space where she should have been. The alarm, when it was finally raised, was not a loud clang of a bell, but a quiet, spreading unease that rippled through the quarters and up to the great house. Master Caldwell received the news on his veranda where he was surveying the damage to his gardens. His face, already a thundercloud of residual fury from the previous days, darkened further. His immediate, unshakable assumption was that she had run and that Jonas had taken her. The thought did not just anger him, it was a deep, personal insult. He felt robbed, not merely of his property, but of his victory. He had been so close to breaking her, to forcing the truth from her, to re-establishing the absolute order of his world. For her to slip away in the night under the cover of the storm was a final, unbearable act of defiance. It was a theft of his power, his satisfaction, his rightful conclusion to the drama. He turned to his head overseer, a grim, hulking man named Miller, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was more menacing than any shout. "She's gone," he said, his jaw tight. "The boy must have taken her. I want a search party, every man you have. I want the dogs." He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a possessive fire that was terrifying in its intensity. "Find them. I don't care what it takes, I want them back." He paused, his gaze sweeping over his rain-washed lands as if he could will her to reappear. Then he looked back at the overseer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, freighted with all the weight of his obsession. "I want her back." The command was absolute. His rage had shifted its focus. The mystery of the stitched name was momentarily forgotten, replaced by the primal, furious need to reclaim what was his. The hunt began immediately, a grim procession of men on horseback and trackers with hounds on leashes fanning out from the main house. The ground was a mess of mud and debris, the air thick with the baying of the dogs as they struggled to find a scent in the rain-scrubbed world. They made their way to the riverbank, the logical destination for any runaway hoping to obscure their trail. The Mississippi was still swollen and brown, its current a churning, powerful force carrying entire trees and pieces of wreckage downstream. It was there at the water's edge that they found them. Footprints, a single set, small and bare, leading directly to the lip of the churning water. The tracks were clear in the soft mud, each one a perfect impression. And then they simply stopped. There were no signs of a struggle, no scuffed earth, no drag marks. There were no other tracks, no sign of a boat having been pushed into the water. It was as if the owner of the feet had walked calmly to the edge of the world and had been swallowed whole by the river. The dogs whined and paced, confused, their noses unable to find any scent leading away from the spot. The search party stood in stunned silence, the silent, powerful river seeming to mock their efforts with its indifferent, relentless flow. Hours later and miles away, they found Jonas. He was not with Leah. He was alone, hiding in a thicket of cane, his meager supplies clutched in his hands, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated grief. He had been waiting, hoping against hope that she would change her mind, that she would appear. The sight of the search party seemed to break him. He was captured easily and dragged back to the plantation, a prize that only deepened the master's fury. The interrogation was brutal. He was tied to a post in the stable yard, the same place where he had last seen Leah, and questioned relentlessly. Caldwell himself oversaw it, his voice a cold, sharp whip. But Jonas had no answers. He genuinely had no idea where Leah was. His confusion and his raw, heartbreaking grief were real, so real that they were infuriating. He sobbed her name, begging them to believe him, telling them she had chosen a different path, a story about the river that he couldn't understand. To Caldwell, this was just another layer of the conspiracy, another lie, another story designed to make a fool of him. The brutal, pointless questioning continued long into the afternoon, Jonas's pain a testament not to his guilt, but to Caldwell's spiraling, desperate need for an answer that the world refused to provide. Days passed, and the silence from the world was absolute. There was no sign of Leah, no body washed ashore downriver, no whispers of a captured runaway from neighboring plantations. It was as if she had ceased to exist. The plantation settled back into its grim routine, but the atmosphere was forever changed. Master Caldwell was a man unraveling. He was defeated, unnerved, and haunted by a mystery that grew larger and more terrifying with each passing day. He spent his afternoons on the grand veranda of the main house, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the distant line of trees that marked the river, his authority a hollowed-out shell. One afternoon, as he sat there, lost in his own tormented thoughts, he saw her. Old Ilara was standing at the edge of the manicured yard just beyond the formal gardens, watching him. She was not working. She was simply standing there, her posture erect, her gaze steady and unwavering. She was not being insolent, yet her quiet, knowing presence felt like a judgment, an accusation. In a moment of pure, unadulterated desperation, the last vestiges of his pride and authority crumbled. He needed an answer, and he no longer cared where it came from. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the stone floor, and strode across the lawn to where she stood. His overseers would have been shocked to see him, the master, approaching a slave in this manner, as if seeking an audience. "You," he said, his voice raspy, stripped of its usual command. He stopped a few feet from her, his fine leather boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "You know where she is. You were the last one to talk to her. You filled her head with your stories." Ilara did not flinch. She did not look away. Her eyes, ancient and deep, met his without fear. She remained silent for a long moment, letting his desperation hang in the air between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was not the voice of a slave addressing her master. It was the voice of a priestess, a keeper of secrets, calm and cryptic and utterly certain. "She is where she belongs, master," she said, her tone even. "She is home." Caldwell stared at her, his rational mind struggling to grasp her words. "Home? What are you talking about? Did she drown? Is that what you're telling me?" Ilara gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of her head. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "The river has a long memory," she said, her gaze drifting past him toward the distant, shimmering water. "It remembers what was taken, It remembers the names that were stolen. Sometimes, Master, it just takes back what was stolen from it. His authority was completely gone, dissolved by the quiet power of her words. He was no longer the master interrogating his property. He was a small, foolish man pleading with an oracle who spoke in riddles he could not comprehend. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. He had been defeated not by a runaway slave, but by a power he could not see, could not name, and could not possibly understand. He turned away from her without another word and walked back to the house, the weight of his own ignorance a heavier burden than he had ever known. He was a man haunted, not by a ghost, but by the maddening certainty that he had lost a game whose rules he had never even known. The discovery, when it came, was not made by the master or his men. It was made by a small, barefooted child, one of the enslaved children who were often left to their own devices, their world a mixture of chores and secret games played in the margins of the plantation. He was down by the river chasing a frog through the reeds, his laughter a bright, carefree sound in the quiet afternoon. He scrambled up a small embankment to a place where a large, flat rock, bleached white by years of sun, jutted out over a calm eddy in the river. And he saw it. He stopped, his game forgotten, his eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and fear. There on the sun-bleached rock was a folded bundle of cloth. It was the master's expensive English linen sheets, the very ones that had been the source of all the trouble. They were not thrown there, not discarded refuse from a desperate escape. They were washed clean, the mud and grime of the storm completely gone. They had been dried by the sun and folded with a perfect, impossible neatness, the creases sharp and deliberate. They were placed with a gentle, deliberate care in the exact center of the rock, as if left as a gift or a message. The scene was eerie and surreal, a pocket of impossible order in the wild tangle of the riverbank. It was not the work of a person fleeing for their life. It was a final, silent statement, an act of closure performed with a calm and otherworldly precision. The child stared, his heart thumping in his chest. He knew, with the simple, unclouded certainty of a child, that he was looking at something magical. He slowly backed away from the rock, his eyes never leaving the pristine white bundle, and then he turned and ran as fast as his legs could carry him, not with the joy of a game, but with the terrified awe of one who has just witnessed a miracle. The sheets were brought to Master Caldwell in his study. He snatched them from the house servant's hands, his own trembling with a mixture of dread and vindictive anticipation. He had been robbed of his captive, but here was the proof of her crime, the indelible mark of her insolence. He dismissed the servant with a wave and turned to his wife, who stood by the window, her face pale and drawn. "Now," he breathed, his voice a dry rasp, "now we shall have the truth of it." He spread the fine linen across the vast polished surface of his mahogany desk, his hands moving with a frantic energy. He searched for the name, the beautiful damning script that had been burned into his memory. His eyes scanned the fabric, his fingers tracing the area where the stitching had been. And there was nothing. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, certain his eyes were deceiving him, that the dim light of the study was playing tricks on him. He leaned closer, his nose almost touching the fabric, his gaze darting back and forth like a trapped animal. The linen was perfect. It was whole. There was no name. There were no needle holes, no discoloration, no faint outline, no sign that a thread had ever pierced its surface. The spot where the name Leah had been so vividly, so impossibly stitched was now just a seamless expanse of pristine white linen. The tear she had been assigned to mend was also gone, the fabric as flawless and unbroken as the day it left the loom in England. It was not unpicked. It was not cut away. It had vanished, as if it had been a hallucination, a fever dream. "No," he whispered, the sound a choked, strangled thing. He clawed at the sheet, pulling it taut, holding it up to the light from the window. Nothing. He ran his hands over the surface again and again, his palms sweating, his mind refusing to process what his senses were telling him. The physical proof of his grievance, the anchor for his rage and obsession, had been stolen from him, not by a person but by an impossible act of magic. All that was left was the memory of the name, a memory that now had no external validation. It existed only in his mind, a private madness. His frantic search slowed and then stopped. He stood utterly still, his hands resting on the impossibly perfect fabric, his knuckles white. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a sound of pure, uncomprehending horror. He looked at his wife, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond anger, beyond reason. He was a man of facts, of ledgers, of ownership, and he had just been confronted with a miracle he could not possess, a crime whose evidence had erased itself, leaving him alone with the maddening, undeniable truth that he had been defeated by a power he could not even begin to comprehend. The story of the vanished girl and the vanished name did not stay within the confines of the Caldwell plantation. It seeped out, carried on the whispers of wagon drivers, riverboat crews, and traveling merchants. It spread like wildfire through the slave quarters of Natchez, then into the kitchens and parlors of the town itself. In the flickering firelight of the quarters, it was told in hushed, awed tones, the details growing more fantastical and more powerful with each retelling. They said the great storm had not been a random act of nature, but that it had been called by Leah, a chariot of wind and rain, to carry her away. They said she did not walk to the river, but that she floated, her feet never touching the muddy ground. They said the river did not swallow her, but that it rose up to greet her like a lover, its waters parting to welcome her home. Leah Brown, the quiet girl from the sewing room, ceased to be a person of flesh and blood. She became a myth, a spirit of the river, a powerful symbol of a freedom so complete it transcended the physical world. She was no longer a runaway who might be caught and returned broken and bleeding. She was an ascendant spirit, a being who had shed her chains not by running from them but by transforming them. Her story became a new gospel, a testament to a power that the masters could not see or understand, a power that flowed in the blood and was held in the memory of the water. She was a whispered prayer on the lips of the oppressed, a secret joy, a fierce and defiant hope. Her act was not one of physical rebellion that could be crushed under a whip, but a spiritual reclamation of her name, her soul, an act so profound it had cleansed its own evidence from the world, leaving the oppressors with nothing but their own maddening confusion. Leah's name was no longer a brand of ownership spoken by a master, but a sacred word, a legend whispered on the wind that blew off the Mississippi, a promise that even in the deepest bondage the soul could find its way home. Months later, the Caldwell plantation was a changed place. The furious energy that had once radiated from the great house had dissipated, replaced by a slow, creeping decay. Master Caldwell was a broken man. The fire in his eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind the vacant, haunted stare of someone who has looked into an abyss and seen his own powerlessness reflected back. He no longer raged. He barely spoke. He had lost his certainty, the bedrock of his entire existence, and in its place was a hollow, echoing silence. He spent his days in his study, not reading his ledgers or mapping his lands, but simply sitting, staring at the wall. Sometimes in the evenings he would walk the grounds, his steps slow and unsteady, his path always leading him to a spot where he could see the distant, shimmering line of the river. He would stand there for hours, a gaunt, solitary figure staring at the water as if hoping it would finally give up its secret, or perhaps hoping it would take him too. His authority, once absolute, was now a hollow shell, a performance he went through with no conviction. The fear he had once inspired had been replaced by a kind of pity among his slaves. which to him was the final, most unbearable humiliation. Old Ilara, in contrast, lived out her days in a state of quiet grace and profound respect. She was no longer just an old woman who knew herbs and stories. She was a figure of immense power, a conduit to the spiritual world that had claimed Leah. People came to her not just for remedies for their physical ailments, but for a balm for their souls. They would sit with her on her small porch, and she would speak to them of the river, of the names, of the memory held in the water, her words a source of strength and quiet defiance. She was feared, but it was the fear born of awe, not terror. She was the keeper of the legend, the living proof that their world contained more than just the master's whip and the master's laws. And far to the north, in the free state of Ohio, a man named Jonas built a new life. He had made it. His journey a long and brutal ordeal of hunger, fear, and relentless perseverance. He found work on the docks of a bustling river town, his body growing stronger, his spirit slowly healing. He never spoke of his past, but he never forgot it. In his pocket he kept a single, soft, iridescent feather, a tangible link to a magic he still did not understand but had come to revere. It was a constant reminder of the woman who had chosen a different path to freedom, whose impossible courage had been the catalyst for his own. Some nights he would walk down to the edge of the Ohio River, and as he watched the dark water flow past, he would whisper her name into the current, a quiet tribute, a promise kept. He had found his physical freedom, the life he had so desperately wanted, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that Leah had found something more. Leah's legacy was not written in books or carved into stone. It was written in the water. Her story became a permanent, unchained part of the landscape of Natchez, a testament to an identity that could never truly be owned. She did not run from bondage, she transformed it, turning the tools of her oppression, the needle and thread, into instruments of a miracle. Her identity was not found in escaping the plantation, but in merging with the timeless, powerful spirit of the river that held the collective memory of her people. The final impossible mystery was not how she vanished, but how her name, the symbol of her defiance, vanished with her, leaving behind only perfect, unbroken linen. It was the ultimate act of grace, an erasure not of her but of her crime, a final gentle closing of the circle. The magic had cleaned its own slate, leaving the master with nothing but the ghost of a name and the ruin of his own certainty. Her name was never seen on linen again, but it was whispered in the rustle of the leaves along the riverbank, in the mournful call of a distant bird, and in the deep, eternal current of the Mississippi. She had not run north to a place on a map. She had returned home to a place in the soul, her name finally and forever free, carried on the water, remembered by the wind. A silent, powerful song of liberation. The river flowed on, holding her story, a secret kept, a legend born, a freedom won.